In the summer of 1871, a man was found dead in a mining camp in western Pennsylvania. He had been an organizer. He had been trying to get the men around him to stop working until conditions improved. He had been warned to stop. He did not stop. And then he was dead, and the men who had watched him get dragged out of his tent went back to work the next morning. Because what else were they going to do? Welcome to Mystery Wild West. And what you're about to hear is not the version most people tell when they talk about law and order in the American West. If this is the kind of history that actually tells you something real, subscribe. We go deeper here than most. Before we go any further, have you ever worked a job where you felt like someone was watching you? Not your boss, someone you could not see, someone you did not know, someone whose job it was to report everything you said, because in the second half of the 19th century, that was not a paranoid feeling. For thousands of American workers, it was simply reality. Most people who know the name Pinkerton think of detectives, private investigators. Maybe they have seen the logo, the open eye, the slogan that said, "They never sleep." It sounds like something out of a dime novel. A man in a long coat following a suspect through foggy streets. That is not the whole picture, not even close. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was founded in 1850 by a Scottish immigrant who had built a reputation catching counterfeiters in the Midwest. By the 1870s, the agency had grown into something that had no clear precedent in American life. It was not a police force. It was not the military. It was a private organization that sold its services to whoever could pay, and the people who could pay were almost always the richest men in the country. Railroad companies, mine owners, steel manufacturers, the men who controlled the infrastructure of the growing American economy. These were the Pinkerton clients, and what they were buying was not just investigation, they were buying surveillance, they were buying infiltration, they were buying men who would go into a labor camp, befriend the workers, earn their trust, and then report every conversation, every plan, every name back to the employer. And when conversation was not enough, they were buying something harder. But let us start at the beginning, because the Pinkerton story did not start in violence. It started in a train car. In the years after the Civil War, the railroads were the most important and most dangerous business in America. Enormous amounts of money moved on those rails. Express cars carried payroll shipments, bank transfers, gold, and men with guns knew this. Train robbery became a genuine industry. Armed groups would stop a train on a remote stretch of track, blow the safe in the express car, and disappear into the landscape before any organized response could reach them. The railroad companies needed someone to deal with this. Local sheriffs had limited jurisdiction and even more limited resources. The federal government had little presence in most of the territories. So the railroads hired Pinkerton. The agency's early work was legitimate by any reasonable standard, tracking train robbers across state lines, infiltrating criminal gangs, building cases through long-term surveillance rather than waiting for someone to be caught in the act. This was real detective work, and the agency was genuinely good at it. They pursued robbery gangs across multiple states, used undercover operatives who spent months embedded in outlaw communities, and built dossiers that were more detailed than anything local law enforcement could produce. The railroad companies needed someone to deal with this. Local sheriffs had limited jurisdiction and even more limited resources. The federal government had little presence in most of the territories. So the railroads hired Pinkerton. The agency's early work was legitimate by any reasonable standard, tracking train robbers across state lines, infiltrating criminal gangs, building cases through long-term surveillance rather than waiting for someone to be caught in the act. This was real detective work, and the agency was genuinely good at it. They pursued robbery gangs across multiple states, used undercover operatives who spent months embedded in outlaw communities, and built dossiers that were more detailed than anything local law enforcement could produce. One particular gang operated across the Midwest and South for nearly 2 decades. They robbed trains, banks, and stagecoaches. They moved constantly. They had sympathizers in communities who warned them when law enforcement was coming. Local authorities could not touch them. County sheriffs had no authority beyond their county line. Federal marshals were few and spread thin. The gang knew exactly where the gaps in coverage were and moved through them like water through cracks in stone. The Pinkertons were different. They had no territorial limits. They followed wherever the client's interest led. They could move operatives across state lines, coordinate between multiple locations, sustain a pursuit for years if the client kept paying. And the railroad clients kept paying, because every robbery was money out of their pocket, and because the public relations damage of an unsolved robbery campaign was significant. The pursuit of one notorious gang became something of a national story. Newspapers followed it. The agency became famous for it. The image of the relentless private detective who never stopped, who would follow a man to the ends of the country, became the public face of the Pinkerton brand. But that brand had a backside that the newspapers did not cover as enthusiastically. But here's the problem. And this is where things change. The same skills that made the Pinkertons effective at catching train robbers made them extraordinarily useful for something else entirely. Something the railroad companies and mine owners had an even more urgent need for by the 1870s. Breaking labor. The American labor movement was growing. Workers in mines, in steel mills, on railroad construction gangs were beginning to organize. They were demanding shorter hours, safer conditions, consistent pay that was not arbitrarily docked for company-stored debts. The employers looked at this and saw a threat to their profit margins, and they looked at what the Pinkertons could do: infiltrate a group, identify the leaders, gather information, be present in large numbers when things became physical, and they made a decision. The agency took the contracts. Now think about what this actually meant on the ground. A Pinkerton operative arrives at a coal mining camp in Pennsylvania or a railroad construction site in Wyoming. He has a cover story. He is a worker looking for employment. He is believable because he has been trained to be believable. He gets hired. He bunks with the men. He eats with them. He listens to every conversation. He is especially interested in who is talking about organizing, who has connections to union leadership, who has complaints that might turn into action. He writes everything down. He sends reports to the agency. The agency forwards them to the employer. The employer now knows exactly who the troublemakers are, who is talking to whom, what the plans are before they become plans. And with that information, they can act. They can fire people before an organizing effort gets traction. They can remove the most effective voices before those voices build a following. They can shut down a labor action before it starts, without anyone knowing exactly how they were found out. The workers never knew who among them was reporting. That was the point. That uncertainty, the knowledge that someone might be listening, that a friend might be an agent, was itself a tool. It made people careful. It made them quiet. It made them less likely to say what they actually thought. The workers never knew who among them was reporting. That was the point. That uncertainty, the knowledge that someone might be listening, that a friend might be an agent, was itself a tool. It made people careful. It made them quiet. It made them less likely to say what they actually thought. Think about that environment for a moment. You're working 12-hour shifts underground. The air is bad. 3 men from your crew died last winter in a collapse that could have been prevented if the company had shored the tunnel the way it was supposed to be shored. You know the conditions are dangerous. You know other men feel the same way, but you do not know who to trust. You do not know who is reporting. So you say nothing. You do your shift, you go back to the company bunkhouse where you owe rent. You eat at the company store where you owe a debt, and you are silent. That silence was worth a great deal of money to the men who employed the Pinkertons. The cost of an operative for a year was far less than the cost of a successful strike. A strike could halt production for weeks or months. It could cost a mine owner or a railroad company enormous sums. The investment in surveillance paid for itself many times over in production that was never interrupted because organizing was stopped before it started. This was understood at the time, and it was discussed in explicit terms in correspondence between company executives and the agency. Surveillance was not a security measure. It was a business investment with a measurable return, and the return was measured in silenced workers. But it gets worse. By the 1880s, the Pinkerton Agency maintained a standing force of private guards that was larger than the standing army of most countries. Let that settle for a moment. A private company, answerable to no elected government, funded by railroad and mining interests, with a military force larger than most nations, not detectives, guards, armed men available for deployment at industrial sites where labor disputes had escalated or were expected to escalate. When a company locked out its workers or brought in replacement labor, Pinkerton guards were there to make sure the replacement workers got through. When workers gathered to block access, the guards were there to move them. This was not, on paper, legal use of military force. But in practice, the distinction between a Pinkerton guard action and a military intervention was often hard to see. The men were armed. They were organized. They were directed by their clients. And the law in most jurisdictions did not clearly prohibit what they were doing. The worst of it came in the summer of 1892. A steel plant in western Pennsylvania. The company had decided to cut wages. The workers' union refused to accept the cuts. The company locked the workers out and announced it would bring in non-union replacements. It also arranged for several hundred Pinkerton guards to be transported by barge to the plant under cover of darkness. The workers found out. They were waiting on the riverbank when the barges arrived before dawn. What happened next lasted most of the day. Gunfire went in both directions. Men were killed on both sides, workers and guards both. The Pinkertons, who had expected to walk in with a show of force and intimidate a crowd into dispersing, found themselves in a sustained battle. By afternoon, with their position on the barges untenable and no prospect of relief, the guards surrendered. They were marched through a crowd that had every reason to be angry. Some of them were beaten. Some of them were badly hurt. The surrender did not go smoothly for either side. The state eventually sent in the National Guard to restore order. The Union ultimately lost. The wage cuts went through. The Union was effectively destroyed at that plant. The men who had fought on the riverbank went back to work at lower pay, or they did not work there at all. That is the outcome. After all of it, after the gunfire and the deaths and the national attention and the congressional investigations that followed, the company got what it wanted. That is not a footnote. That is the point. And the men on the other side, the workers who had fought on that riverbank, who had held the barges at bay for most of a day, Many of them were arrested afterward, charged with crimes, tried, some convicted. The Pinkerton guards who had arrived under cover of darkness, armed, to break a legal labor action, very few of them faced any legal consequence at all. The law did not treat both sides of that battle equally. It never does when one side has the resources to shape how the law is applied. A miner from that plant tried to find work in the steel industry for the next several years. He could not. His name was in the files. He did not know this. He knew only that every application was rejected, that every foreman turned him away without explanation, that the work he had spent his adult life learning to do was somehow no longer available to him. He moved to another state. Same result. He eventually found work in a different industry, at lower wages, doing work that was harder on his body. He never understood why. Nobody told him. Nobody was required to. The congressional hearings that followed the battle were extensive. Members of Congress were genuinely alarmed by what the Pinkerton Agency represented, a private army operating on behalf of private business interests with no government oversight, no legal accountability, and the ability to deploy armed force anywhere in the country where a client was willing to pay for it. The hearings produced reports. The reports produced concern. The concern produced, eventually, a federal law that prohibited the hiring of Pinkerton agents specifically for use against workers in labor disputes. That law passed in 1893, and then the agency simply renamed its guard division and kept operating, because the law named the Pinkertons specifically. Not the practice, not the concept of private armed guards deployed in labor disputes, just that name. And names can be changed. A new division, a new name on the paperwork, the same men, the same weapons, the same contracts, the same clients. The congressional response had been outpaced within a year by a legal workaround so simple it barely required a lawyer to draft it. The senators who had expressed alarm during the hearings went back to their other business. The agency went back to its other business. And the workers in the mines and the mills went back to their shifts, still watched by men whose organization had simply changed its name on the letterhead. Now, here is a detail that does not appear in most histories of this period. The Pinkerton Agency kept files, detailed, extensive files, on labor organizers, on union leaders, on anyone identified by their operatives as a potential source of trouble for their clients. By the 1890s, these files represented the most comprehensive private database of political and labor intelligence in the country. They knew who the organizers were, where they had worked, what they had said, who they were connected to, and they sold access to that information. A company hiring workers could pay for a background check against the Pinkerton database. If a man applying for a job appeared in those files as a known organizer or union sympathizer, he would not be hired. He might not know why. He would not be told. He would simply be turned away. And he would find, if he tried to get work elsewhere in the same industry, that the same thing happened again. The files followed people. The blacklist was real, and the Pinkertons maintained it. Think about what it means to be on that list. You're a miner. You tried to organize your co-workers for better safety conditions after a cave-in killed 3 men. Someone reported you. Your name went into a file. You do not know this. You move to another state looking for work. You apply at the mines. You are turned away. You apply somewhere else. Turned away again. You cannot understand why. Your skills are good. Your record is clean. But the file exists, and it follows you, and it will keep following you. This happened to real people, many of them. The agency also had a more direct approach for situations where surveillance and blacklisting were not sufficient. There is also the question of what happened to communities where Pinkerton operatives had been embedded for extended periods. In some cases, the operative became genuinely integrated into the community. He knew the families. He attended the same church. His children played with their children. And then, one day, the contract ended or the situation changed, and he disappeared. The people he had left behind, who had trusted him, who had shared their lives with him, discovered either what he had been or simply never saw him again. That damage does not show up in any official record. There are no numbers for broken trust, no count of the friendships that were revealed to be instruments of surveillance. No tally of the communities where people afterward became permanently suspicious of any newcomer, permanently guarded, permanently less willing to organize or speak openly, because they had learned at cost what openness could mean. That erosion of trust was a product of the agency's methods as surely as the reports it filed. It was not a side effect, it was part of the effect. In certain cases, particularly in areas where labor organizing had strong support and where the employer wanted it, stopped permanently. The Pinkertons used a tactic that can only be described as manufactured evidence. An operative would infiltrate a group, encourage more extreme talk, sometimes propose more radical actions himself, and then report the group to the authorities as dangerous and violent. Men were arrested based on that testimony. Men were convicted. In at least one documented case involving a series of murders in the Pennsylvania coal region in the 1870s, the Pinkerton testimony that sent men to the gallows was later seriously questioned by historians who examined the evidence carefully. Whether those men were guilty of what they were convicted of, or whether they were convenient targets selected partly because they were effective labor organizers, is a question that has never been cleanly answered. But they were hanged, and the organizing in that region collapsed afterward, and the employers went back to work. Here's a question worth sitting with. When a private company can deploy armed men, maintain intelligence files, infiltrate communities, and provide testimony that sends people to the gallows, and do all of this legally on behalf of paying clients, where does law enforcement end and something else begin? The Pinkerton Agency operated in a space where that line was almost impossible to see, and the clients liked it that way. There is a side of this story that tends to get romanticized. The Pinkerton men who tracked the famous outlaw gangs across the frontier, the long-running pursuit of the gang that robbed trains and banks across the Midwest and South for years. The patient, methodical work of following a trail across hundreds of miles of open country. Some of that work was genuinely impressive. The level of organization required to maintain surveillance across multiple states, to coordinate between operatives in different locations, to build a picture of a criminal network through accumulation of small details. This was sophisticated work for its era. The agency developed methods that would later become standard practice in law enforcement. But here is the thing about those same methods when applied to labor organizing rather than train robbery. The skills are identical. Infiltrate a group, build trust, gather information, identify the leadership, report back to the client. The technique does not change based on whether the group is planning a robbery or a strike. The moral weight of the target changes everything. The method itself is neutral, and the agency applied it in both directions without distinguishing between them. A man who robbed trains was a criminal. A man who tried to organize his co-workers for safer working conditions was, in the eyes of the law, exercising a right. In the eyes of the Pinkerton clients, he was a threat of the same order, and in practice, he was treated as one. That equivalence between criminal activity and labor organizing was one of the most consequential decisions made by the most powerful men in 19th century American industry. And the Pinkerton Agency was the instrument that made that equivalence operational. By the end of the 19th century, the agency was the most powerful private intelligence and security organization in the world. It had files on hundreds of thousands of people. It had operatives embedded in industries and communities across the continent. It had a track record that included genuine law enforcement work and also included things that would now be called human rights violations without much argument. And it was entirely legal. There was no federal law that clearly prohibited what it was doing. The states where it operated mostly did not interfere. The courts generally sided with property rights over labor rights when disputes ended in litigation. The political climate in Washington was shaped significantly by the railroad and mining interests that were the agency's largest clients. The system was not broken. It was working exactly as it had been built to work. It was just working for some people and against others. And the people it was working against were usually the ones with the least ability to fight back. Here is the final piece that most people never hear. The American labor movement eventually made significant gains. The 8-hour workday, safety regulations in mines and factories, the right to organize without being fired. These things exist today because people fought for them, often against men employed by agencies exactly like the Pinkertons. Those fights were not clean. People died. People were imprisoned on manufactured evidence. People lost jobs and could not find others because their names were in a file somewhere. People were beaten on picket lines by private guards who faced no legal consequences. The gains were real. The cost was enormous. And the men who paid the cost, the organizers, the strikers, the men whose names went into the files, are almost entirely anonymous today. We do not know most of their names. We know the names of the men who hired the guards. That is how history tends to work. The gains were real. The cost was enormous. And the men who paid the cost, the organizers, the strikers, the men whose names went into the files, are almost entirely anonymous today. We do not know most of their names. We know the names of the men who hired the guards. That is how history tends to work. Here is one last scene worth carrying with you. Somewhere in the 1880s, a man is sitting in a train car heading west. He is well dressed. He carries a leather case. He is reading a newspaper. Nothing about him suggests anything unusual. He could be a salesman, a land agent, a traveling businessman of some kind. He is a Pinkerton operative on his way to a new assignment, a mining camp in Colorado where the workers have been showing signs of organization. His job for the next several months will be to live among those workers, earn their trust, and report on what they are planning. He has done this before. He is good at it. He has a family somewhere, a wife, children. He sees a few times a year. He sends money home. He tells them he works in mining, which is close enough to true that he does not have to think about it much. The train moves west through flat country. Outside the window, the landscape is huge and empty and indifferent. Towns appear and disappear. Other passengers get on and off. He puts down the newspaper. He looks out at the country passing by. He is thinking about his cover story. He is thinking about what kind of man he needs to be in the camp to be trusted. He is good at becoming whatever a situation requires. The train does not know what it is carrying. The country outside does not know. The workers in the camp ahead do not know. They will meet him in a few days and decide, within the first week, whether they trust him. Most of them will. That is the Pinkerton story. not the famous pursuits, not the frontier legend. A man on a train, heading toward people who do not know he is coming, with a job to do and a leather case and a cover story that he has told so many times it feels almost true. That is what the Wild West actually looked like in the places where the real power was being contested, and finding, more often than not, that the answer was not the men in the bunkhouse. The Pinkerton Agency trained law enforcement, not directly, not through any formal program, but through the transfer of methods and personnel. Former Pinkerton operatives went on to work for city police departments, for federal agencies, for private investigators across the country. The techniques developed to track train robbers and surveil labor organizers became the foundation of modern investigative practice. The open eye, the file system, the undercover operative who builds a cover identity over months, the coordination of information across multiple locations. These are now standard tools of law enforcement. Their origin is partly in the Pinkerton Agency, which developed them not in service of justice in any general sense, but in service of paying clients who wanted results. When you read about a police department using an informant to infiltrate a community and report back on what people are saying, you are looking at a technique with a direct line back to the bunkhouses of 1880s mining camps. Whether that technique is legitimate depends entirely on who is using it and for what purpose. The technique itself does not care. That is worth knowing. There is one more dimension to this that almost never gets discussed. The Pinkerton Agency was not the only organization of its kind. The success of their model inspired imitators. By the 1890s, there were dozens of similar private detective and guard agencies operating across the country. Some were smaller regional operations. Some were barely disguised criminal enterprises with hired muscle and a detective agency license as legal cover. The Pinkerton brand had created a market, and the market was served by men of varying quality and varying ethics. A coal company in West Virginia that could not afford Pinkerton rates could hire a cheaper regional agency. The cheaper agency used the same methods but with less oversight and fewer professional standards. The reports were less accurate. The operatives were less disciplined. The guards were sometimes men who had no other employment options. The results were often more violent and more chaotic. The Pinkerton Agency at least had a reputation to protect. The imitators frequently did not. This is what an unregulated private security industry looks like when it operates without legal constraints. The best actors set a floor. The worst actors find the space below that floor and fill it. And the people living and working in the areas where these agencies operated had no reliable way to tell the difference until something went badly wrong. A Pinkerton operative sits in a bunkhouse in a Wyoming mining camp in 1886. It is late. The men around him are asleep. He is writing his report by the light of a candle stub. He writes down everything he heard today. Who said what? Who met with whom after the shift? Which men seemed most interested when the subject of wages came up? He seals the report. Tomorrow, he will find a way to get it to the post office in the nearest town. The men sleeping around him do not know who he is. They shared a meal with him tonight. They think he is one of them. He has been here 3 months. He knows their children's names. He knows who drinks too much and who is sending money home to a sick mother. He knows all of it. He finishes writing. He blows out the candle. He lies down in the dark and listens to the breathing of the men around him. He gets paid by the day. The report he just wrote may get some of those men fired. It may get them blacklisted. He does not know which ones. That is not his job. His job is to report. What happens after that is someone else's decision. He closes his eyes. Outside, the night is cold and the camp is quiet. In the morning, everyone will go back to work, including him. That is not a dramatic story. It does not have a clear villain and a clear hero. It has men doing their jobs inside a system that had decided certain things were acceptable. That is what the Pinkerton story actually is. Not a frontier adventure, a mirror, held up to a country that was figuring out in real time who the law was for, and finding, more often than not, that the answer was not the men in the bunkhouse. The Pinkerton name eventually faded from its most notorious associations. The agency still exists today, absorbed into a larger security corporation, its history selectively remembered. The famous I logo is still there. The slogan about never sleeping is still there. The parts about the bunkhouse operatives and the blacklists and the barges arriving before dawn, those parts tend not to appear in the official history. But the methods survived. They were absorbed into law enforcement, into corporate security, into the broader architecture of surveillance that became part of American institutional life. The techniques outlasted the controversies. The controversies were forgotten. The techniques were not. That is the real legacy of the Pinkerton Agency, not the famous cases, not the frontier pursuit stories. The methods. The understanding that a private organization with enough money can shape the lives of working people in ways that are completely legal, entirely invisible, and almost impossible to fight. That lesson was learned well, and it was never unlearned.